January 17th, 1941. Morning light breaks cold and pale over the English Channel. At 22,000 feet, the air is so thin it burns the lungs. Flight Lieutenant James MacLachlan's oxygen mask hisses rhythmically, the only sound louder than his own heartbeat. His left arm, what remains of it, throbs beneath the modified flight suit. 6 months ago, surgeons had taken everything below the elbow. Now, a leather cup and metal prosthetic replace flesh and bone. The joystick trembles under his remaining hand. Below, the Channel's gray waters stretch toward France like hammered steel. Above, 3 Messerschmitt Bf 109s circle like wolves that have scented wounded prey. The Germans called pilots like MacLachlan Invaliden, invalids, men who belonged in hospitals, not cockpits. The Luftwaffe had strict medical standards. A missing finger could ground a pilot permanently. An entire arm? Unthinkable. Their doctrine emphasized physical perfection, symmetry, completeness. The Reich's propaganda celebrated the Übermensch, the superior man, unblemished and whole. Disability represented weakness, genetic failure, something to be hidden or eliminated. When German intelligence reported that the RAF had returned a one-armed pilot to combat duty, the reaction ranged from disbelief to contempt. It seemed desperate, even pathetic. The kind of decision a dying empire makes when the barrel scrapes empty. But the English had always measured men differently, not by what they'd lost, but by what remained. MacLachlan had lost his arm on August 24th, 1940, over Kent. A Bf 109's cannon shell had shredded muscle and bone, leaving his left forearm hanging by threads of flesh. He'd landed the Hurricane one-handed, nearly unconscious from blood loss. 6 months of recovery. 6 months watching other pilots scramble while he fought phantom pains and the certainty that his war had ended. The Air Ministry's decision to return him to operations wasn't desperation. It was mathematics. Britain had lost 544 pilots in the summer of 1940. MacLachlan could still fly, could still shoot, could still kill. The prosthetic weighed 11 ounces, less than a full ammunition belt. RAF engineers had modified his Spitfire Mark IIA's controls, rerouting throttle and trim functions to his right hand, adjusting the rudder pedals for one-sided compensation. The aircraft's serial number, P7G666, would soon enter the peculiar mythology of the war. The 3 Bf 109s descended from the sun, exactly as the manual prescribed. Angriff aus der Sonne. Attack from the sun. Blind the enemy before he sees you. The lead pilot, likely a veteran of the French campaign, would have noted the Spitfire's slightly erratic flight pattern, the way it favored right-hand turns, the subtle asymmetry in its movements. Easy prey. The Messerschmitts dropped like stones, engines screaming, cannon armed. MacLachlan saw them 2 seconds before they opened fire. 2 seconds purchased by the rearview mirror his ground crew had mounted above the canopy. Not standard equipment, British improvisation, the kind that drove German technical officers to distraction. He rolled right, the world spinning into a blur of gray sea and pale sky, tracer rounds stitching empty air where his cockpit had been. They expected him to run, a damaged pilot in a damaged service, clinging to survival. Instead, MacLachlan climbed. The Spitfire's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, 175 horsepower of British engineering, pulled him vertical. The Germans followed, confident textbook pursuit. Altitude meant advantage, energy meant life. They'd learned this over Spain, over Poland, over France. But MacLachlan wasn't climbing to escape. At 24,000 feet, he rolled inverted. The Spitfire hung upside down, canopy pointing toward the earth, wings slicing through frozen air. The prosthetic arm, strapped tight against the modified control column, held steady. Blood rushed to his head. The horizon became the sky. The sky became the ground. This was the moment the Germans couldn't process. Inverted flight wasn't new. Pilots performed it in training, in aerobatics displays, in brief moments of combat maneuvering, but sustained inverted flight, flying upside down for more than seconds, fighting upside down, violated every principle in the Luftwaffe Dienstvorschrift, the service manual that governed German aerial doctrine. The human body couldn't sustain it. Blood pooled in the brain, vision blurred, consciousness faded. The carburetor-fed engines of the Bf 109 would starve and die if inverted for more than 20 seconds. A design flaw the Germans knew intimately. Their fighters could roll and recover, but not fly inverted. The Spitfire's fuel injection system had no such limitation. MacLachlan could fly upside down until his fuel ran dry or his neck broke. The lead Bf 109 pilot made his first mistake. He assumed MacLachlan was out of control, tumbling, panicking. He closed for the kill, positioning himself above what he thought was a helpless target. Instead, MacLachlan fired from below, technically above, given his inverted position, 8 303 Browning machine guns converging at 250 yards. The textbook said deflection shooting required precise calculation. Target speed, relative velocity, bullet drop, lead time. MacLachlan had flown 150 combat missions before losing his arm. His calculations were instinct. The tracer rounds walked up the Bf 109's belly like a ladder of light. The German fighter's fuel tank, unarmored and positioned directly behind the pilot, erupted. The Messerschmitt became a meteor, a streak of burning aviation fuel and torn aluminum falling toward the channel. The second pilot broke left, diving, trying to force MacLachlan to follow, to invert back to normal flight, to reset the engagement into familiar geometry. But MacLachlan remained upside down, pulling what should have been down but was now up, the Spitfire's wings bending under inverted G-forces. His vision tunneled, red creeping into the edges. The prosthetic dug into his stump, leather straps cutting circulation. He ignored it. Pain was just information. The second Bf 109 filled his gun sight, inverted gun sight, world reversed, and he fired again. Shorter bursts this time. Ammunition conservation. 3 seconds of mechanical thunder. The German's port wing shredded, fabric and metal peeling away like skin. The Messerschmitt rolled uncontrollably, a corkscrew descent into the sea. The third pilot was either the bravest or the most foolish. He didn't run. He inverted his own aircraft, trying to match MacLachlan's impossible geometry, to fight on equal terms. But the Bf 109's Daimler-Benz engine choked immediately. Fuel starvation, cylinders gasping, propeller windmilling uselessly. The German pilot had perhaps 10 seconds before gravity and aerodynamics killed him. He rolled desperately back to normal flight, engine coughing back to life, black smoke trailing. MacLachlan rolled with him, a mirror image, an inverted shadow. They completed a full rotation together, a grotesque waltz at 23,000 feet. When both aircraft leveled, MacLachlan was on the German's tail, 200 yards, perfect firing position. The Bf 109 pilot jettisoned his canopy, preparing to bail out. MacLachlan held fire. The German hauled back on his stick, climbing, trying to gain separation. MacLachlan followed, still inverted, the world still wrong. One more burst. The Bf 109's engine seized, cowling, disintegrating, coolant streaming white. The German rolled once, twice, then fell, not burning, just falling. Pilot already gone, parachute blossoming white against gray sea. MacLachlan rolled upright. The world snapped back into its proper orientation, sky above, sea below. His head pounded, vision swimming with afterimages and burst capillaries. The prosthetic had rubbed his stump raw, leather dark with blood and sweat. His right hand trembled on the stick, muscles screaming from holding inverted flight for nearly 4 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat. 4 minutes of sustained inverted flight. 4 minutes of fighting upside down. 4 minutes that should have been impossible. He turned for home. The English coast emerging from morning haze, the white cliffs of Dover like a promise kept. The combat report filed that evening was clinical. 3 enemy aircraft destroyed, ammunition expended, approximately 2,400 rounds. Damage to own aircraft, minor stress fractures in wing spars, later confirmed by ground crew. Duration of engagement, 6 minutes, 12 seconds. Method, sustained inverted flight and gunnery. The intelligence officer who took the report thought MacLachlan was joking. Pilots didn't fight upside down. Pilots couldn't fight upside down. Not for minutes, not with one arm. The gun camera footage proved otherwise. Grainy black and white images of Messerschmitts burning, filmed from an inverted perspective that made viewers dizzy. The film circulated through fighter command, like contraband. Watched in silent mess halls, projected on briefing room walls. Men who'd flown 1,000 hours stared at the impossible geometry, trying to understand how flesh and will had overcome physiology and doctrine. German intelligence received confirmation of the engagement through standard channels, radio intercepts, reconnaissance reports, the absence of 3 pilots who never returned to base. The initial assumption was error, mistranslation, British propaganda. No one flew sustained inverted combat. No one with a prosthetic arm flew combat at all. But the reports persisted, corroborated, verified. The one-armed pilot existed. He hunted over the channel. He fought upside down. The revelation spread through Luftwaffe squadrons like a virus. If the British were so desperate they returned cripples to combat, the invasion was imminent, victory certain. But if those cripples were winning, if a man with one arm could destroy 3 aircraft while flying inverted, what did that say about the Reich's doctrine of perfection? About the philosophy of the superior man? The Spitfire itself became a symbol, though few recognized it consciously. The aircraft represented something the Germans couldn't replicate: adaptability married to individual initiative. The Bf 109 was magnificent, faster in a dive, better armed, excellent in experienced hands, but it was rigid. The carburetor system couldn't be easily modified. The doctrine couldn't accommodate individual variation. The Luftwaffe trained pilots to a standard, then demanded they maintain that standard. The RAF trained pilots to a baseline, then let them exceed it however they could. MacLachlan's modified controls, his improvised tactics, his willingness to fight inverted, none of it would have been permitted in the German system. Modification suggested the original design was flawed. Improvisation suggested doctrine was incomplete. Individual initiative suggested the collective might be wrong. There were other one-armed pilots, though few fought. Douglas Bader, more famous, more decorated, had lost both legs and still flew Hurricanes and Spitfires, still commanded squadrons. The Germans knew of Bader, even respected him in their way. But MacLachlan's victory was different. Bader's prosthetics were legs, irrelevant to flying, arguably advantageous, immune to G-force blackout. MacLachlan's was an arm, directly connected to aircraft control, to the physical interface between pilot and machine. He shouldn't have been able to fly at all, much less fight, much less win. Yet he did. The psychological impact on German pilots was subtle, but measurable. Combat reports from early 1941 show increased caution over the channel, wider formations, more conservative tactics. Not fear of the RAF broadly, but uncertainty about assumptions. If a one-armed man could kill you while flying upside down, what other assumptions were wrong? The British didn't publicize MacLachlan's victories immediately. Operational security mattered more than propaganda. But word spread anyway, through the peculiar networks of war, mechanics boasting to mechanics, pilots drinking with pilots, the slow percolation of extraordinary fact through ordinary conversation. By March 1941, MacLachlan was flying regularly, P70666 under him, the channel below, the war continuing its grinding consumption of men and machines. He would survive until 1943, eventually reaching the rank of squadron leader, accumulating 16 confirmed kills. He would lose his life not over Europe, but over Malta, shot down during Operation Pedestal, dying in his cockpit, strapped to his modified controls, still fighting. But that January morning in 1941, none of the future mattered. What mattered was the impossible made real. 3 German pilots had climbed into their Messerschmitts that morning, confident in their doctrine, their training, their understanding of how aerial combat functioned. They'd seen a lone Spitfire, noted its erratic flight, identified an opportunity. They'd followed their manual, executed their tactics, done everything correctly, and they'd died anyway, shot down by a man who shouldn't have been in a cockpit, using tactics that shouldn't have worked, fighting in a geometry that shouldn't have been sustainable. The wrongness of it, the fundamental violation of expectations, was the victory itself. Not just the 3 aircraft destroyed, but the certainty destroyed with them. The prosthetic arm became the symbol, though MacLachlan himself never spoke of it publicly. Leather and metal, 11 ounces, strapped to a stump. It represented what the war would ultimately become. Not a conflict between perfect systems, but between adaptable ones. Not between supermen, but between ordinary men willing to become extraordinary through necessity. The Germans built better tanks, better aircraft, better guns in many cases, but they couldn't build better improvisation. They couldn't manufacture the willingness to modify doctrine, to let a one-armed pilot fight, to accept that sometimes the manual was wrong and the individual was right. In the decades after, historians would document the engagement as a footnote, a curious incident, remarkable for its tactical oddity, but strategically insignificant. 3 Bf-109s lost meant nothing in a war that consumed thousands of aircraft. One pilot's victory meant nothing in campaigns that involved millions. But the men who fought over the Channel in 1941 understood differently. They knew war wasn't won in factories or planning rooms, but in moments of impossible choice. Moments when the body failed and the will persisted. Moments when doctrine said retreat and instinct said attack. Moments when a man with one arm and a modified Spitfire proved that perfection was less valuable than resilience. The sea claimed the 3 German pilots that morning. The Channel held them in cold embrace, 300 feet down, entombed in their aircraft. Their names appear in Luftwaffe casualty lists, 3 more entries in ledgers that would eventually fill libraries. They were young men, well-trained, brave in their way, certain in their doctrine. They died because they believed what they'd been taught, that disability meant weakness, that improvisation meant disorder, that fighting upside down was impossible. They died because they couldn't imagine an enemy who refused to accept limitations, who modified his aircraft and his tactics and himself until victory became possible. They died because they met James MacLachlan on a January morning when the air was thin and cold, and learned too late that the measure of a man isn't what he's lost, but what he refuses to surrender. The sky remembers nothing. The sea keeps everything. But somewhere in the collective memory of nations, in the mythology that wars create and survivors maintain, there remains the image of a Spitfire hanging inverted against pale clouds, 8 machine guns firing downward at the earth, a one-armed pilot fighting gravity and doctrine and expectation, winning because he refused to understand why he should lose. This is what the Germans couldn't believe. Not the kills themselves, but what they represented. That abundance isn't measured in limbs or aircraft or perfect systems, but in the refusal to accept impossibility. That freedom means the liberty to modify, to adapt, to fight upside down if the situation demands it. That democracy's greatest weapon isn't superior force, but the willingness to let individuals exceed the manual, to trust that a man with one arm might see solutions that men with two arms never imagine. The war would continue for 4 more years. Millions would die. Cities would burn. Nations would collapse and reform. But on January 17, 1941, at 22,000 feet over the English Channel, 3 German pilots learned a truth their commanders would spend the rest of the war trying to deny: that the side willing to let broken men fight, willing to modify doctrine for individuals, willing to accept that sometimes the impossible is just the difficult done upside down, that side possessed an advantage no amount of superior engineering could overcome. The leather prosthetic, blood-stained and worn, strapped tight to a stump that screamed with pain, had written a verdict in tracer rounds and falling Messerschmitts. Not about British superiority, not about German weakness, but about the singular power of human refusal. The refusal to quit, to conform, to accept that limitation is fate. 3 aircraft fell that morning. With them fell certainty. And in its place, doubt entered the Luftwaffe's collective mind, a whisper that would grow louder with each passing month. If we're wrong about this, what else might we be wrong about? The answer, of course, was everything. But they wouldn't understand that until the end, when the Reich burned and the doctrine turned to ash, and the supermen revealed themselves to be just men after all. Men who'd believed too deeply in perfection, who'd rejected adaptation, who'd never learned to fight upside down when the situation demanded it. MacLachlan's victory wasn't strategic. It was prophetic. A glimpse of how the war would end, written in the morning sky over Dover, signed by a man who'd lost his arm but kept his will, who flew inverted because the enemy expected him to fly straight, who won because he refused to understand why he should lose.